Imagine a night of laughter and celebration as a group of friends gather to celebrate a bachelorette party. Layla, a black woman with a joyful spirit, is soaking in the happiness of the night. But suddenly, her evening is shattered by an officer who steps far out of line, humiliating her in front of her friends without reason. Yet what he doesn't know is who her husband really is, a man with the power to change everything in one revealing moment. What will happen when this officer's prejudice meets an unexpected truth, and how will this shocking encounter end? Stay tuned until the end to witness the surprising twist that turns this night upside down. If stories of justice and resilience resonate with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow us to the end to see how it all unfolds. Layla stepped into the bachelorette party of her best friend with an unmistakable sparkle in her eye. Tonight was special. Not only was her dear friend about to start a new chapter in life, but it was also a rare chance for Layla and her closest friends to let loose, to laugh without reserve, just like they used to back in the carefree days of youth. Layla, a strong and spirited black woman, was the heart of every gathering. Her warmth and energy were infectious. She knew just how to make people feel at ease, bringing laughter and joy to everyone around her. The celebration was set in a bustling public area downtown, a lively spot known for its diverse crowd and welcoming vibe. It was the kind of place where people from all walks of life gathered, a space where backgrounds melted into the rhythm of music, laughter, and light. The soft glow of city lights mingled with the warm evening air as Layla and her friends took their seats under gentle amber lights, toasting to friendship and love, and sharing memories of their years together. The night was alive with energy, the chatter and clinking of glasses blending into the vibrant city backdrop, creating an atmosphere that felt both intimate and exhilarating. Throughout the evening, Layla's phone buzzed occasionally with messages from her husband, Eric. Eric was a police captain, respected by his peers and known for his dedication to justice and integrity. But outside of his role in the police force, Eric was a devoted husband, tender and protective. To him, Layla was everything. Although he couldn't be there with her tonight, Eric texted regularly, checking in to make sure she was safe and enjoying herself. His messages, filled with warmth and care, reminded Layla of just how much he loved her and how committed he was to her happiness. They had a strong bond, one rooted in respect, protection, and genuine friendship. Layla could feel Eric's affection with every word he sent, and she knew she was safe, knowing he was always watching out for her, even from a distance. Since their marriage, Eric had been her constant source of support and protection, standing by her side not only as a husband, but as a friend and a rock she could always lean on. It was this feeling of safety and assurance that gave her confidence to enjoy herself fully, knowing that she was cherished and loved. As the night wore on, the laughter continued to flow freely. Layla and her friends reminisced about the past, danced without inhibition, and shared their best wishes for their friend's upcoming marriage. For Layla, tonight was one of those rare, cherished moments where all of life's worries faded away, allowing her to fully immerse herself in the pure joy of friendship. She could feel the love of her friends, the energy of the night, and the peace of knowing she was in a place of trust and happiness. It was as though nothing could disrupt this beautiful moment. But what Layla couldn't foresee was the dark turn that would soon unfold. In the midst of all this celebration, an event was about to occur that would challenge her strength in ways she had never imagined, casting a shadow over what had started as a night filled with laughter and light. The evening was in full swing when Officer David entered the area on his routine patrol. Tall, with a stern expression and an air of self-importance, he seemed to scan the crowd with a judgmental eye, his face betraying a hint of disdain. He was a man who carried himself with an arrogance that seemed to fill any space he entered, and tonight his gaze landed squarely on Layla and her group of friends. David's eyes narrowed as he observed them laughing and enjoying the celebration. His gaze lingered on Layla, his expression shifting from mere scrutiny to something more contemptuous. In his mind, This particular group of women, especially a confident, outspoken black woman like Layla, didn't belong here. His thoughts carried the weight of prejudice that he didn't bother to conceal as he approached the group, his eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of authority and animosity. With an air of uninvited authority, David walked over to Layla and her friends, his footsteps slow and deliberate, each step a subtle declaration of dominance. Layla, initially oblivious to his approach, was taken by surprise when she noticed the uniformed figure standing imposingly nearby. She offered a polite, if puzzled, smile, hoping it would be enough to diffuse whatever assumptions he seemed to be making. "Is there a problem, officer?" Layla asked, her voice calm but with an underlying firmness. David's gaze swept over her, his face expressionless, but the tension in his stance spoke volumes. He looked her up and down, his eyes full of an unsaid judgment, before giving a small, cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Just checking on things," he replied, his tone dripping with insincerity. He glanced around at her friends, then back at her, as though she alone was the source of whatever suspicion had crossed his mind. "Can't be too careful, you know. We have to keep the area respectable." His words stung. The implication was clear, and Layla felt a flush of anger rise within her, but she maintained her composure, reminding herself that reacting to such prejudice wouldn't serve her any good. "Oh, we're just here for a friend's celebration," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We're not causing any trouble." David raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer, breaching her personal space in a way that was both invasive and intentional. "Is that right?" he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Funny, you don't look like you belong around here." Layla felt the sting of his words even more sharply this time, the insult cutting through the joy of the evening and leaving her feeling exposed and humiliated. She glanced at her friends, who had gone quiet, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. One of her friends, Mia, stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her tone biting, "but what exactly are you implying?" David shifted his gaze to Mia, his expression hardening. "Oh, I don't think you want to be asking me questions right now," he sneered, a hint of threat in his voice. "This isn't your business. I'm talking to her." His gaze fell back on Layla, who was trying to keep her calm in the face of his obvious provocation. Unable to contain herself any longer, Layla took a steady breath and spoke up. "Look, officer, we're just here like everyone else, celebrating, minding our own business. There's no reason for you to treat us differently." David let out a short, contemptuous laugh, shaking his head as if she'd said something absurd. "Differently?" he echoed, mockingly. "I'm just doing my job, making sure the area stays safe, and you look like trouble." Then, with a move that was subtle yet unmistakable, David placed his hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and uncomfortably lingering. It was an act that crossed every boundary of decency and respect. Layla froze, caught off guard by this sudden, unwelcome contact, her face a mask of shock and horror. "See, I have a duty," he said softly, his voice dripping with condescension as he leaned in slightly closer, his grip tightening, "to keep people like you from disturbing the peace." Layla felt a wave of humiliation crash over her, the weight of his prejudice and contempt bearing down on her like a physical force. She wanted to pull away, to shake off his hand, but the audacity of his actions left her momentarily paralyzed. The indignity of being touched against her will, of being treated like an outsider, was a wound that cut deep, made even worse by the fact that he was doing it so brazenly, with her friends as witnesses. Her friend Mia, horrified by what she was seeing, stepped forward again, her voice shaking with fury. "Let go of her, now!" she demanded, her voice quivering with a mixture of fear and anger. David turned his gaze back to Mia, his eyes flashing with irritation. "I'd watch your tone if I were you," he said coldly. "You don't want to make this situation worse." Layla's other friends began murmuring, trying to stand up for her and demanding that he back off, but David simply looked at them with an air of disdain, as though they were beneath him. He straightened, releasing his grip on Layla's shoulder but remaining close enough to continue his intimidation. "You know," he said, addressing the group, "this isn't the place for people like you to be acting out. Maybe you should find somewhere else to go." The group fell silent, a mix of anger and helplessness rippling through them. They were acutely aware of the power imbalance, of how little they could do without risking further harassment, or worse. The realization settled heavily among them, the joyful spirit of the night now soured by David's actions. Layla took a deep breath, regaining her composure, but the damage was done. The weight of humiliation and the sting of being made to feel inferior in such a public, degrading way left her with a hollow ache. She met David's gaze, refusing to let him see the extent of her pain, even as her heart pounded with a mixture of anger and shame. "We're not going anywhere, officer," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "We have as much right to be here as anyone else." David's lips curled into a smirk, a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. "We'll see about that," he muttered, taking a step back but keeping his gaze fixed on her, as though challenging her to resist further. Layla's friends stood by her, their faces set with silent determination. They might not have been able to change David's mind, but they wouldn't let him chase them away either. It was late in the evening when Eric's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. Sitting alone at home after a long shift, Eric picked up his phone and saw a video file sent by Layla's close friend Mia, along with a message. "Eric, you need to see this. It's about what happened to Layla tonight. She didn't want to worry you, but this was too much to ignore." Curious yet apprehensive, Eric opened the video, not knowing the shock that awaited him. As the video played, he watched Layla and his bachelorette gathering as they laughed and enjoyed each other's company. Then, the scene shifted, and Eric's heart dropped. A white officer entered the frame, approaching Layla and her friends with a look that was all too familiar to Eric, a mixture of contempt and entitlement. The officer's behavior quickly turned intrusive and inappropriate. Eric felt a rising anger as he watched Officer David's demeanor shift from dismissive to invasive, placing a hand on Layla's shoulder in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate and humiliate. As the video ended, Eric's hands shook slightly from the flood of emotions running through him: anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming urge to confront David. He clenched his fists, feeling an intense protectiveness toward Layla. No one had the right to treat her this way, least of all an officer who was supposed to uphold respect and justice. But then a different thought crossed his mind, one that made him pause. Eric knew that if he went in right away, his anger could compromise the situation, turning it into a personal confrontation rather than a clear case of abuse of power. He needed to handle this, not only as Layla's husband, but also as the captain within the police department. Eric's resolve deepened. Instead of rushing in and confronting David immediately, he began to form a plan that would expose David publicly in a way that would leave no room for excuses. With his mind set, Eric texted Mia to thank her for sharing the video. He assured her that he would handle the situation and asked her to keep it quiet for now. Eric wanted to make sure David wouldn't suspect that the husband of the woman he had harassed was now watching his every move. The next day, Eric arrived at the precinct with a calm yet determined demeanor. He worked out the details with the chief, requesting a meeting in which several high-ranking officers, including David, would be present. He ensured the meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, giving him enough time to set everything in place. In his mind, he replayed the footage, preparing himself for the confrontation that would follow. His plan wasn't merely to confront David, but to reveal his behavior in a way that would force accountability from everyone in the room. As the appointed time arrived, Eric entered the meeting room. He took a seat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. One by one, Officers entered, taking their seats, including David, who strode into the room with the same air of arrogance Eric had seen in the video. David barely acknowledged Eric, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Eric's composed exterior. As the meeting commenced, the chief initiated routine discussions on departmental issues, maintaining an air of normalcy. Then, as if casually, Eric brought up the importance of respect and professional conduct. Recently, we've had some reports of officers overstepping boundaries with civilians, Eric began, his gaze shifting subtly toward David. There's a particular incident that has come to my attention, and I believe it's a clear example of conduct unbecoming of an officer. I'd like to share this example with everyone here to ensure we're all on the same page regarding respect and decency toward the public. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he still seemed unaware of what was about to unfold. With a calm expression, Eric took out his phone and cast the video onto the large screen at the front of the room. Silence fell over the room as the footage began to play. Eric kept his gaze fixed on the screen, observing each reaction around the table. In the video, David's condescending attitude toward Layla and her friends was painfully evident, as was his invasive behavior. Each officer in the room watched with growing discomfort and disbelief as David's actions unfolded on screen. Eric noticed the chief's face turn a shade paler, his brows knitted together in disapproval. When the video ended, the room was enveloped in a tense silence. David's face was flushed, his expression a mix of shock and embarrassment as he realized the weight of the evidence against him. Eric let the silence hang for a few moments before he finally spoke, his voice steady and controlled. "Officer David," Eric said, his tone cold and unyielding, "would you care to explain what we just saw?" David stammered, his face still red as he tried to form a coherent response. I was just making sure they weren't causing any disturbance," he managed to say, though his voice faltered under Eric's unrelenting gaze. Eric tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Is that so? Because from what I see here, it looks more like harassment and intimidation." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. "You didn't know it at the time, Officer David, but the woman you targeted in this video happens to be my wife." Gasps rippled through the room. David's eyes widened, his expression shifting from embarrassment to outright horror as he realized the full extent of his misjudgment. The other officers exchanged glances, some of them visibly uncomfortable as they processed the revelation. Eric continued, his voice unwavering. "Let me be clear. Your actions were not only unprofessional, but showed a complete disregard for basic respect. As officers, we have a responsibility to uphold the law impartially. What you did here shows the opposite." David looked down, clearly humiliated and at a loss for words. Eric glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on each of his fellow officers, ensuring they understood the implications of David's behavior. The chief cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice firm. "Officer David, you will be placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation." As David was escorted out of the room, the remaining officers were left to reflect on the incident. Eric knew this wasn't just about punishing one man's actions. It was about setting a precedent, about making it clear that prejudice and abuse of power had no place in their department. He turned to his fellow officers, his voice calm, yet resolute. "We are here to serve and protect every member of our community," Eric said, his gaze steady. "Anyone who uses their position to intimidate or degrade others is a threat to the very principles we stand for." The officers nodded, absorbing the weight of Eric's words. The video had left an indelible mark, a stark reminder that the power they held came with an even greater responsibility, to wield it justly. The atmosphere in the police station was business as usual, as officers moved about engrossed in their daily routines. Among them was Officer David, moving through the precinct with his usual air of arrogance, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Meanwhile, Eric entered the precinct, his expression composed but his gaze intense. He scanned the room, quickly spotting David, who was casually chatting with another officer. With a calm demeanor, Eric approached David and signaled him over with a nod. David turned, looking slightly confused but uninterested. He had no idea who Eric was, and certainly didn't recognize him as anyone important. Eric kept his tone measured, his expression neutral, and said, "Officer David, could we speak in private for a moment?" David gave him a cursory glance, then shrugged, interpreting Eric's request as an opportunity to exert his own superiority. "Sure," he said dismissively, barely masking his disinterest. He led Eric to a quieter corner of the precinct, away from the hustle of the main area. To him, this was likely some routine encounter, a trivial matter he could brush off. As they moved further from the crowd, David's casual attitude remained unchanged. In fact, he even smirked, evidently not taking Eric seriously. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, and said with a slight sneer, "So, what's this about?" Eric took a deep breath, maintaining his composure as he looked directly at David. "I need to ask you about your conduct toward a woman named Layla last night," he said, his voice calm but sharp, each word deliberate. At the mention of Layla's name, David's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider, a hint of mockery in his eyes. "Oh, her?" he scoffed. "Yeah, I remember her. Causing a bit of a ruckus, weren't they? A bunch of them taking over the place like they owned it," he shrugged, his dismissive tone filled with disdain. Eric felt a surge of anger, but he kept it contained, his face betraying nothing. He nodded slightly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Funny you mention that," Eric said, his voice steady. "I'd like you to watch something." He pressed play on the video Mia had sent, holding the phone out so David could clearly see. The moment David's face came into view on the screen, his smirk faded, his expression turning from one of mild amusement to growing concern. The video showed his entire interaction with Layla, from his patronizing attitude to the moment he placed his hand on her shoulder, the mocking tone in his voice clear as day. As the video continued to play, David's face flushed, his posture stiffening as he realized the full extent of what had been captured. His eyes darted from the screen to Eric, a flicker of panic crossing his face as he sensed the danger he was in. Still, he tried to recover, his voice weak but defiant. I was just doing my job," he stammered, "keeping things under control." Eric gave him a cold, unwavering stare. "Under control?" he repeated, his voice low but intense. "Because from where I stand, it looks more like harassment, and you crossed every line of professionalism." David's bravado cracked further, but he clung to his arrogance, crossing his arms defensively. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right to lecture me about my job," he snapped, his tone laced with irritation. "I don't need some stranger telling me how to handle the public." At that, Eric gave a faint, knowing smile, the final piece of his plan falling into place. Without breaking eye contact, he stepped back slightly and raised his voice just enough for nearby officers and his superior to hear. "I think you misunderstand, Officer David," Eric said clearly. "I'm not some stranger. I'm Captain Eric Hill, and Layla is my wife." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. His mouth opened, then closed as his face drained of color, realization dawning upon him in a rush. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with shock and horror as he registered Eric's words. The other officers in the vicinity, now paying full attention, exchanged shocked glances, whispers breaking out as they absorbed the significance of Eric's statement. Seeing David's stunned expression, Eric held up his phone once more and glanced around at the gathering crowd of officers and superiors. "I think it's time we all see the conduct of Officer David and understand what it means to abuse power," he announced, pressing play on the video once again, this time for everyone in the room to witness. The video played to a silent audience, the tension in the room thick as each person watched David's actions unfold on screen. The expressions around the room ranged from shock to anger, and a few officers looked away, uncomfortable with what they were seeing. It was undeniable the footage showed David in a light that no amount of excuses could dim. The police chief, who had joined the crowd, stepped forward, his face a mask of anger and disappointment. He looked from the video to David, his expression hardening. "Officer David, this is unacceptable," he said, his tone resolute. "You've not only violated our code of conduct, but you've disgraced the department and abused the authority entrusted to you." David, visibly shaken, attempted to speak, but the words failed him. He stood frozen, a mixture of shame and fear flickering across his face as he looked around, his gaze pleading for sympathy from his colleagues, but none of them met his eyes. The silence of their disapproval was more damning than any words could be. Eric took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "As officers, our duty is to serve and protect, not to intimidate or humiliate. When one of us crosses that line, it dishonors everyone in uniform. What happened last night wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a violation of the respect and trust we're supposed to uphold." The chief nodded, his expression grim. "Officer David, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Your behavior is not representative of this department, and there will be consequences for your actions." David, stripped of his former arrogance, looked defeated, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He muttered a weak apology, but it fell flat in the silence of the room, leaving him to grapple with the full impact of his behavior alone. Eric met his gaze one last time, a look of quiet but firm disapproval, a reminder that actions had consequences. As David was escorted out, the remaining officers exchanged somber glances, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a shadow. They understood that this wasn't merely a disciplinary action. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of the responsibility they carried with their badges. With the confrontation over, Eric turned to the chief, nodding in mutual respect. "Thank you for handling this fairly," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. The chief returned the nod, his face softened by a look of understanding. As Eric walked out of the precinct, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that Layla would be proud, that justice had been served not only for her, but for every person who deserved respect and protection. It was a victory not just for them, but for the principles they both held dear. The aftermath of Eric's confrontation with David left the precinct in a state of stunned silence. Eric's decision to expose David's actions publicly without demanding an immediate punishment sent shockwaves through the department. Rather than calling for instant disciplinary measures, Eric had deliberately stepped back, leaving David to face the judgment of his colleagues and superiors, a consequence that, in many ways, felt more profound. For David, this was a devastating moment. As the video of his conduct circulated within the department, the disapproving glances and murmured conversations around him felt like knives, piercing any remnants of pride he had left. He could no longer escape the weight of his actions. The officers who once worked beside him were now looking at him with disappointment, distrust, and even disgust. They whispered about how they had never seen such blatant disrespect from one of their own, and many were appalled that David had let prejudice influence his actions so blatantly. Over the following days, the department conducted a thorough investigation into David's conduct. Each officer who had witnessed the video was interviewed, and David's own record was scrutinized for any past complaints or indications of bias. The inquiry extended beyond his recent encounter with Layla, delving into previous incidents where David's behavior may have hinted at similar tendencies. For the first time, David felt the harsh light of scrutiny turned upon him. as his reputation was torn apart, piece by piece. As the investigation continued, the weight of his actions began to sink in deeper. David found himself alone, ostracized by his peers, and unable to escape the judgment that followed him through every hallway and room in the station. The once confident officer, who had taken pride in his authority, was now a pariah, shunned and isolated. It was a humbling, even humiliating experience, one that left him questioning every decision he had made leading up to that fateful encounter with Layla. Eventually, the police chief summoned David to a disciplinary hearing, where his actions would be formally addressed. The room was filled with high-ranking officials, some of whom had once respected him, others who barely knew him, yet all present bore witness to the evidence against him. His superiors reviewed his actions, discussing the severity of his breach of conduct and the damage it had done not only to his career, but to the reputation of the entire department. In a voice barely above a whisper, David admitted to his wrongdoing. He could feel the shame settle deep within him as he acknowledged that his actions had crossed every line of professionalism and respect. There was no defense he could offer that would justify his behavior, and he knew it. The disciplinary board decided that David would face a series of penalties, including suspension without pay, mandatory sensitivity and diversity training, and ultimately, a demotion. But that wasn't all. David's punishment included one more stipulation: a public apology. The department believed that an open acknowledgement of his wrongdoing was necessary not only to demonstrate accountability, but to attempt some form of reconciliation for the harm he had caused. For David, this was perhaps the most painful consequence of all. The thought of standing before Layla and Eric, admitting his fault, was a prospect that filled him with dread. On the day of the apology, a small press conference was arranged. Local media had caught wind of the incident, and a few reporters gathered alongside members of the department. Layla and Eric were also present, standing together at the front of the room, their expressions calm yet resolute. They were there not to relish David's humiliation, but to witness the justice they had sought. Justice that was now being served in full view of the public. When David stepped forward, he looked smaller, humbled in a way that was evident to everyone in the room. His voice wavered as he began, each word laden with the weight of his shame and regret. To Layla and Captain Eric Hill, and to everyone here today, I stand before you to acknowledge my actions and to apologize for my conduct, he began, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet Layla's eyes. I know that what I did was wrong, and there is no excuse for the disrespect and prejudice I showed. My actions reflected poorly not only on myself, but on the values that this department is supposed to uphold. I understand now how deeply I failed in my duty to serve with honor and respect, and for that I am truly sorry. As he finished, David looked up, his eyes meeting Layla's for a brief moment. In her expression, he saw neither anger nor triumph, only a quiet strength and resilience. She nodded slightly, acknowledging his apology, but making it clear that the damage he had caused would take time to heal. Eric, standing beside Layla, remained calm and composed. The apology did not erase the pain that had been inflicted, but he knew that the public nature of David's admission was significant. David had not only disgraced himself, but had been forced to confront his prejudice in the most humbling way possible. This was not simply a matter of punishment. It was a reckoning, a reminder to everyone in the department that discrimination, no matter how subtle, would not go unchecked. In the weeks that followed, the incident continued to reverberate within the community and the department. Training sessions on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias were implemented, and discussions about respect and equality became more prominent topics within the precinct. The event had left an indelible mark, prompting officers to examine their own attitudes and behaviors more closely. For David, life within the department was forever changed. His reputation was damaged beyond repair, and the friendships he had once enjoyed with colleagues had withered. He no longer received the same respect, nor the same camaraderie as he once had. Instead, he was met with a quiet, lingering judgment, a reminder of the actions that had led to his downfall. Meanwhile, Eric and Layla continued with their lives, but the experience had left an impact that would not soon fade. They had endured an injustice, faced it head-on, and emerged stronger, a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of prejudice. For Layla, the ordeal had been painful, but it had also reaffirmed her belief in the importance of accountability and the power of standing up for oneself. Their story became a source of inspiration within their community, a reminder that even in the face of discrimination, justice could prevail. Layla's courage and Eric's commitment to fairness had sparked a conversation that went beyond their personal experience, resonating with others who had faced similar injustices. Through their actions, they had shown that integrity, strength, and love were powerful forces, capable of challenging even the most deeply ingrained biases. As for David, the consequences of his actions served as a lasting lesson, a reminder of the harm that prejudice can inflict and the price of failing to treat others with respect. He would carry the weight of his actions for the rest of his career, a cautionary tale for those who believed they could misuse their power without consequence. The legacy of this incident would live on as a testament to the value of accountability, respect, and, ultimately, the power of justice to bring about lasting change. The story of Layla and Eric spread quickly, gaining attention from community members and media outlets alike. The incident was not merely about an act of injustice. It was a powerful reminder of the profound impact of prejudice and the necessity of accountability. As the details unfolded, people across the community were moved by the strength and dignity that Layla and Eric showed in the face of adversity. Their experience became a touchstone for conversations about respect, empathy, and the importance of standing up for what is right. Layla and Eric didn't seek fame or recognition. They only wanted justice and respect. But, as their story resonated with others, it became clear that their struggle had grown beyond a personal ordeal. They had become symbols of resilience, reminding everyone that dignity cannot be compromised by the prejudices of others. Layla's quiet strength and Eric's steadfast commitment to justice became a source of inspiration for many, sparking discussions in homes, workplaces, and community forums. Local leaders took note, organizing panels and discussions about prejudice, abuse of power, and the need for reform in public institutions. Community groups invited Layla and Eric to speak, and they used these platforms to share their experiences. They spoke openly about the pain they felt and the challenges they faced, but they also emphasized the importance of responding to injustice with courage and integrity. Eric often said, "It's not about punishment, it's about setting a standard. When we let prejudice go unchallenged, we teach people that it's acceptable. But when we confront it, we make it clear that everyone deserves respect." The precinct, too, had been deeply affected by the incident. Many officers felt a renewed sense of responsibility, recognizing that their positions came with the duty to uphold fairness and respect for everyone. David's suspension and public apology were reminders of the consequences of failing to live up to these standards. It forced each officer to reflect on their own biases and attitudes, questioning whether they too harbored judgments that could cloud their judgment. For some, it was a painful process, but it was also necessary. Eric's example, as a captain who held not only others, but also himself to the highest standards, became a model of leadership within the precinct. His decision to expose David's actions in a calm, fair manner underscored his belief that accountability is essential to justice. Through his actions, Eric showed that true leadership is about fostering an environment of trust and respect, not just enforcing rules. As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of Layla and Eric's experience continued to spread. Community members who had previously felt marginalized or mistreated found strength in their story, feeling validated in their own experiences. Local activists and advocates saw an opportunity to push for broader change, citing Layla and Eric's story as evidence of the need for institutional accountability. Small changes began to take shape within the precinct. Regular sensitivity training was introduced, and officers were encouraged to engage in discussions about implicit bias and community relations. Layla, who had once felt vulnerable and humiliated, found herself growing stronger. She realized that her experience, as painful as it was, had helped to shine a light on issues that too often went unnoticed. She became a voice for others who had faced similar situations, offering her story as proof that even in the face of discrimination, dignity and self-respect could prevail. Her message was simple yet powerful. Respect doesn't come with a uniform or a title. It comes with how you treat others. For Eric, the experience deepened his commitment to fostering an environment of respect within the precinct and beyond. He used his position not only to enforce rules, but to advocate for a more just and equitable society. When asked how he managed to maintain his composure, Eric often replied, "Justice isn't about anger, it's about courage. It's about holding firm to what's right, no matter how difficult the situation." Their story resonated not only in their local community, but also reached a national audience, as media coverage highlighted the importance of holding authority figures accountable. Letters poured in from people across the country, individuals who had faced discrimination, families who had experienced the pain of prejudice, and those who simply admired Layla and Eric's courage. Each message reinforced the impact they had made, the ripple effect of one couple's resilience in the face of injustice. For David, the aftermath was one of deep reflection and regret. His career, once a source of pride, had been forever marked by the consequences of his actions. The shame he felt was not just because of his suspension or the loss of respect from his peers, but because he had violated the trust of the very community he was supposed to serve. His apology had been public, but the internal journey he faced was private and complex. He was left to confront his own prejudices and shortcomings, forced to acknowledge the harm he had caused. In time, David took steps to rebuild himself, attending workshops and community meetings, hoping to understand the perspectives he had once dismissed. His journey toward redemption was far from easy, but it was a necessary one. Layla and Eric's story had opened his eyes to the humanity he had overlooked, and he realized that his growth depended on his willingness to confront his past mistakes. The incident and its aftermath became a lasting lesson for the community. Layla and Eric's ordeal was more than just a story of one couple standing up to prejudice. It was a testament to the power of resilience, empathy, and accountability. Their experience underscored that justice is not just about laws and policies, but about treating each person with the respect they deserve. It reminded everyone that power must be wielded responsibly, and that courage and compassion are essential to building a fair society. As the months passed, Layla and Eric's story became a beacon of hope. They had shown that even in the face of bias and injustice, it was possible to stand firm, to demand respect, and to inspire change. Their experience left an indelible mark on their community, serving as a reminder that true justice requires both accountability and empathy. Layla and Eric knew that their fight wasn't over. They continued to advocate for justice, using their experience to bring awareness and understanding to issues of prejudice and discrimination. Their journey was one of healing and hope, a powerful example that every individual, regardless of their background or position, deserves to be treated with dignity. In the end, Layla and Eric's story was a testament to the belief that justice is not just an ideal, but a commitment to act with fairness, compassion, and integrity. It became a call to action, urging others to examine their own behaviors, to stand up against injustice, and to strive for a world where respect and empathy are the foundations of every interaction. Their legacy would live on, a reminder that change begins with courage, and that the power to create a just society lies in the hands of those who are brave enough to stand for what's right.